So I'd like to kick things off. I would just present very briefly kind of a quick set of ideas about how this fits into the broader scheme of what I've been working on for a little while now, which is this whole notion of seeing around corners and how can we be more, how can we think more broadly, be more mindful of the possibilities that face us when we're in these really unprecedented moments. So I'll start off with this idea of an inflection point. And those of you who know my work know that an inflection point is something that exerts a 10x force on your business. It changes your assumptions in some radical way. And I think it's really important to remember that when you're in the midst of an inflection point, you don't get to go steady state. You don't. It changes things. So you're either going to benefit from it and really succeed, or it's going to take your business into some kind of decline, or it's a combination of the two. So Ron and I were just talking to a potential client the other day, and this is a company that has absolutely thrived throughout the pandemic. And as the pandemic begins to look as though it's coming to a logical conclusion, they're kind of scratching their heads and saying, okay, how are we adding value, once the products that we offer are no longer in such high demand? Anybody who's in paint and lumber and, all the supplies for spare rooms, those businesses are going to be facing a very different environment than they had faced. So I think the core thing to remember about inflection points is you don't get the option of staying where you are. They're either going to take you up or they're going to take you in a different direction. And that's really what we wanted to talk about today, which is how do we think strategically as we move through this of what's going to be different. So the first principle for really thinking differently about the future is looking at the concept of what kind of indicators are we paying attention to as we think about what's coming. And the first big observation I would make is that there are three kinds of indicators. Lagging indicators, great information about stuff that's already happened. You can't change a lagging indicator. And unfortunately, for a lot of organizations, they're fixated on lagging indicators. So things like, how did we do this quarter is a question that comes up sometimes. Well, as anybody who's in a forward-looking company will tell you, the results we got this quarter were baked, maybe 2 years, even 3 years ago. So it's a lagging indicator. It's not a bad thing to measure. It's just that it's not going to help you when you look at the future. Then we have current indicators, and those are useful, right? Things like employee engagement. How hard is it to hire people? Where do we think we need to be investing in better net promoter scores? Those kind of things. They kind of tell you where you are. It's like the speedometer in your car. How fast are you going? The hardest thing to get a hold of are leading indicators. And that's what I really want to focus our conversation today on, which is what are the plausible things we want to have in our minds strategically as we think about where we're headed. And this brings me to the early warnings model. I talk about it in the book, Seeing Around Corners, but it's this reality we all have to deal with as strategists, is that the changes that are going to be super important for us begin as very weak signals, right? The strength of the signal is not that strong. And then slowly, then they start picking up steam, right? So you get this sort of gradually and then suddenly phenomenon. And then finally, when you get to what I call time zero, the inflection point is upon us. We know what it means. We've got facts, right? We understand what's happening now. The trouble is if you wait till then to make a strategic choice, it's late. It's too late because in strategy, you've always got another line. The degree of strategic freedom that you have is inversely related to the strength of the signals that you have to work with. It's one of the fundamental frustrations of being a strategist, right? By the time you know what the right answer is, it's too late. And so our challenge when we're dealing with this kind of dynamic is how do we move our decision processes back from time zero to what I call the period of optimal warning, which is that period in the middle where you've got enough confidence in the signals that you can start to make sense of them. But it's not so late that everybody else has figured it out as well, and there's no strategic advantage to be gained. So how do we do this? So a very practical way to do this is we posit some time zero events that we want to be thinking about, plausible events that could happen in the future that we want to be monitoring. And then we work backward in time from those events and ask the question, for that to happen, what would have to be true? What would have to be in the case? And I think it's a very interesting moment to be thinking about these time zero events. Now, a couple of notes on early warnings. Do not confuse your preferences with predictions. And this, I think, is something we all fall into. We would like a certain future to evolve. So that's the one we plan for. And that's the one we think about. And that's the one we embrace. Unfortunately, as Gary Hamel's very fond of saying, the future is remarkably indifferent to your preferences. So you really need to be opening your mind to what happens if, this doesn't happen. What's our plan B? Is our strategy robust to multiple possible futures? And we've seen an awful lot of corporate disasters where this wasn't the case. And, a very commonly known one is General Electric, which essentially doubled down a huge bet on the fossil fuel scenario being dominant for energy in a world where the price of renewables was dropping like a rock. And they locked themselves into a fixed asset future, and that's not what happened. In fact, it was only one of several possible futures that they could have been planning for. So you want to watch out for that. So here, what we're thinking about is a couple of time zero events that are potentially really important. So let's not just focus on the events we prefer. Let's also recognize that the benefit of a leading indicator is not necessarily whether what it predicted came true. In fact, some of the most powerful leading indicators I've ever seen are those where it was so profound and so strong that the thing it predicted never happened because we prepared. So what a leading indicator is there for is mental and organizational preparedness about a future time zero event. So here we are. It is June of 2021. And we're getting ready to get back out there, right? New York and California have just announced no restrictions. We're opening up. The city's jammed. You can't get a restaurant reservation in New York for love or money. People are out in the streets. People are talking about reviving live performances. Theaters are playing to packed audiences. And as far as a lot of people are concerned, we're done. That chapter is over. We're going to go live our lives. And the question you have to ask yourself is, okay, that's a preference. Let's go do that. But in terms of time zero events, let's think about 9 months from now. 9 months from now. So I want you to think forward to March of 2022, which is about 2 years after the world shut down. And I'm going to take two time zero events. Time zero event number one is masks off. No problem. The newspaper headline that would go like that is March 15th, in a fantastic combination of public health moves, availability of vaccines, the triumph of science, the world reopened safely. That might be the headline, right? There is a future I would not prefer, which is masks off, big problem. And what that time zero looks like is, pockets of recurrence, pockets of spikes. You pin your annual year on a conference that you're planning in Cincinnati, and 2 weeks before the conference, you have an outbreak. What do you do? And so, I think we need to be thinking about what are the early warnings we want to be paying attention to, because certainly over the globe, the pandemic has not left us. In fact, there have been more deaths so far in 2021 globally than there were in all of 2020. So my question for those participating and for Ron to kick off the discussion is, how robust are our strategies in each of those time zero scenarios? And what are the early warnings we might encourage people to be looking for? So before we turn it over to conversation, I just wanted to also say we have resources for you. So Ron and I are working in an organization called Valise, which I founded a few years ago, to go from, great thoughts and ideas to really tools and taking action and being willing to move forward, with practical things that you can use to bring strategy under uncertainty, to make innovation mastery graspable, and so forth. So when I wrote Discovery Driven Growth together with Ian McMillan, we invented a thing called the bare bones net present value calculator. And that's essentially a pretty fancy spreadsheet that allows you to use 9 input variables to basically measure or estimate the value of a project. And it's very useful for people in working in organizations for whom everything has to be accompanied by a spreadsheet. So if you're interested, you can go to the Valise.com website, click on the resources tab. You can download it for free, play around with it. And the great thing about that is if you're having the kind of conversation where somebody says, well, I don't think your advantage is going to last that long, you're like, fine, put in your numbers and let's see what happens. It can be a great way to get some clarity around what are the assumptions we're actually making. We also have a lot of articles. We've got videos which go on the Valise.com deeper dive, as well as a LinkedIn newsletter that I have, and Ron also posts quite often on LinkedIn. We publish articles. They come out every Tuesday. You can subscribe on LinkedIn. I have a monthly newsletter that I publish. You can also find both of us on Twitter, on YouTube, and Fireside Chats, which is what we're doing today.